Well, to round out this discussion, I'm delighted to introduce Susie Gear. Susie has a really substantial CV with a portfolio of roles that include consulting projects for the UK government and for the Oxford University Business School. She's a patient advocate for NHS England's Rare Disease Advisory Group, and she is Chief Executive of Alport UK. She has a real passion for using her really extensive business expertise to bring together collaborations, really innovative collaborations around Alport syndrome across patients, clinicians, academic science and industry, and all focused on bringing a brighter future for patients with Alport syndrome. And she's here today representing the Alport Alliance, and we'll discuss patient perspectives on disease naming. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd really like to thank the Kidney Week organisers, and particularly Rachel Lennon, for inviting a patient to talk. It's a fantastic event, ASN. I've been here for many years now, and being back in person has just reminded me how important it is for us patients to be able to interact with all the laboratory scientists, the clinicians, etc. here, and what a pleasure it is to join you. Thank you. So I'm going to focus today on a naming project, Naming for Alport Syndrome. And in terms of, there are a number of people that I'd like to start with, but firstly, I have no disclosures, except that I'm not a scientist. But I would like to thank all our collaborators on this naming project, because they are many and various. But firstly, it was a project that was prompted by ClinGen, and we have a lot to thank Alicia for, and the organisation, and the setting up of the expert panel, who I know a number of you are involved in that. And as patients, we thank you all very, very much for worrying about these things and taking the time to debate them. The Alport Syndrome Alliance has a small steering group that is leading on the project. So Professor Francis Flinter, who is involved in the genetics of Alport syndrome, Rachel Lennon, Professor Judy Savage, who's also very involved and is very sadly not here for climate reasons. She's helping us, particularly this week, by not being here, and I know she's online and is listening in. And also Rosa Torra, who has fantastic experience around the clinical aspects. The wider group of collaborators to thank also too is our workshop organising committee for the Alport Syndrome Alliance. As you will see, there is a cast of many very important people from around the world, and we are hugely grateful to them because they are a virtual group. None of them is paid to do any of the work, to come on our calls that are usually monthly, and they are fantastically generous with their time, and we are so dependent on their knowledge of working with patients, and we're hugely grateful. You'll see they're a very diverse group across different disciplines too. And then, last but not least, the collaborators, the patient groups. We have fantastic leads for each of our national patient groups, and they partner with all our collaborators in our workshops on an equal basis. As a number of our nephrologists and people worry desperately, we don't use titles in our workshops because it's very important that we're there for our individual representation and not for the hierarchy that we represent, because every idea is valuable, whether it comes from somebody who's a scientist or not a scientist. So in terms of what does naming mean for patients, I've got a number of specific outcomes for this talk. Specifically living with Alport syndrome, why is naming so important? The challenge of labels, how labels impact our mental health as patients, our mental health and well-being. What can labelling of brands achieve? Really, it's a combination of rational and emotional. I know it's slightly tricky in a scientific environment talking about emotions, but it's very important for us as patients. Then the practical considerations. There are a number of lessons that we've learnt so far, and I have to say the project with ClinGen is ongoing at the moment, so they are very much what we've learnt so far. But finally, the message for us about patients being central is absolutely vital, and we really want to avoid tokenisms. Naming really needs to begin with patients and end with patients, because ultimately they are our customers. So I will talk from two perspectives. Firstly, as a patient, but also as a business executive. I've had 3 decades working in the marketing and business consulting world, and I was a partner at Accenture, which is an international consulting firm. So if I start with the personal perspective, on the left is my mother, Sally Gear. She was diagnosed at the age of 24. Well, it was over 40 years ago now. She then went on to have 2 transplants after a significant period of dialysis. And she was lucky enough to have a physician at Oxford who was able to diagnose and connect the deafness and the hearing so long ago. On the right is my cousin Louise, or Wiz, as she is fondly known. You might get an idea of why. She went into kidney failure aged 14 and had 2 transplants too. I also have an aunt and a sister with Alport syndrome as well. So 2 things to note. We all have X-linked Alport syndrome, and it is not a male-only disease. Every man has a mother, potentially a sister, and potentially a daughter. So there are 2 women for every man that potentially could have Alport syndrome. And it's really important that clinicians understand that, and that the labelling in the past has been a bit of a misunderstanding. And the other complicating factor is that despite all of us having the same genetic variant, all of our clinical features are different. We all are on different spectrums. So my sister, my aunt, and myself have much milder symptoms or features compared with my mother and my cousin. Rather than just talking personally, this talk is very much dedicated to Sally and to Wiz, but also to the people all around the world who are living with Alport syndrome. And particularly to my 3 boys, who are actually seen here on the left, in Beijing. Why in Beijing? They were the inspiration for the China Patient Organization. And Mr. Kai, who, if I can get my pointer here, who you can see behind me, this is Mr. Tai here, is a really important man, because he came to our first international workshop on Alport syndrome, and he observed my sons running around with their iPads interviewing the likes of Billy Hudson as to why he had come all that way to Oxford to be involved in this workshop. And Mr. Tai was absolutely transformed, and he sat me down and he explained that in China, patients living with a rare disease like Alport syndrome are shut behind a closed door, because a rare disease is a social thing that one should not see. And he was terribly worried because he had this most gorgeous son who was the same age as my eldest son, who he wanted to be a hugely successful young man. He was a very bright young man, and yet he had no role models to actually do that. And he saw the role models in my sons, which for us was a very, very moving thing. So Mr. Tai went back to China and worked with lovely Jai Ding, the professor at Beijing, has done so much work for Alports. And they set up the China Patient Organization, which has been transforming and unifying for all the patients across China, which is such an important area in terms of those of us working in the developed world, helping those who are working in an area where they have less facilities. And I know Jai Ding has made amazing steps forward with helping patients like Mr. Tai's son, who is now, you can see him on the right, on the Beijing Underground. Jack has had a transplant, like my son Patrick, who is in the burgundy T-shirt. And Jamie on the left, my youngest son, will need a transplant probably in the next year. Now, in terms of what it feels like to be a patient, I really wanted to get down personal. And for the next bit of my talk, I'm going to move on to one of our very engaged young adult people, a chap called Sam Clark. Sam is a filmmaker. And he contacted Alport UK in 2019. I remember picking up the phone. I actually answered the call at the time. It was 10 o'clock at night. And he was a desperately, desperately depressed young man, worried about his Alport syndrome and what the outcome would be. He has a very complicated family history of lots of very significant illness due to Alport syndrome. I'm going to hand over to Sam to tell his story.
My doctor explained to me that I had a time bomb inside of me when I was 10 years old. I always expect the worst. Alport syndrome causes hearing loss, eye abnormalities, and kidney failure.
We can see that your kidney function is deteriorating quite fast.
It looks as though I'll be on dialysis within 12 months. I've always wanted to do something for charity, but never knew what.
I'm going to cycle 10,000 kilometres around Europe and jump out of a plane in every country I visit.
Oh, man!
Accepting something is the hardest thing to do.
I could smash this. I'm not going to lie and say that I'm not scared either.
This trip is very likely to accelerate the decline in your kidney function.
I just don't know if I can actually carry on. What am I doing? I feel like I've been punched in the face.
So you're having leg swelling because your kidney function is down?
This is something completely beyond my control. It causes a lot of anxiety.
It's alright doing whatever takes your mind off it, but the fact is, it's always there.
Looks like there's a storm creeping in behind me. All I want to do is escape it. All the time, I just want to escape it.
When you start learning about how to change your mindset and stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start to think, well, what can I learn from it? But it's making that decision to focus on the positives instead. And just what if this is no longer a journey into kidney failure, but a journey into self-healing? Welcome to my roller coaster.
I don't want to have sex with men.
My left hearing aid has just broken. This is absolute hell to ride on. I just got to keep going, and I will never give up.
Stop. Lisa, do you understand?
Okay. I think Sam's story, this is a trailer for an actual documentary that he's created. So watch this space, because we're putting together a proposal at the moment for him to take to the likes of Netflix and Amazon Prime to potentially sell it. We really think it's an important message to get out there, and he has a wonderful attitude now to how he deals with things. And I think the important message coming out of it for Sam is that his life changed when he connected with the patient organisation, and he connected with other people who are living with the same condition. He'd never spoken to anybody outside his family before, and he found that transforming. And that's a really important message that he wants to get across for people living with Alport syndrome, and those of you who are diagnosing people. So we've heard a lot over the last few days about the spectrum of clinical features, and certainly as a family, because we all have such different versions of Alport syndrome, people are often saying, why on earth are you different to your sister, to your mother? And it's very important because we actually describe it how each of our versions are on a different spectrum, and even down to our hearing. So I have hearing loss, whereas my sister doesn't. So I think it's very important to understand that the features are at different ends of mild and severe, etc. Recent research is also telling us that Alport is the most common genetic kidney disease. And I thank to my colleague Andre and his talk yesterday, along with ADPKD. And so it is becoming increasingly important to make sure that we get the naming of these conditions absolutely correct, so that people actually understand what situation they're in. And in the case of somebody like Sam, the time bomb label is quite complicated. So moving on, if we look at the different modes of inheritance, Professor Judy Savage actually showed this summary at the last international workshop that we had recently in September at IPNA in Calgary. And what is interesting is that not all modes of inheritance actually have the syndromic features. So if you look up at the top, it describes the classic Alport syndrome of kidney failure, hearing loss, and the eye abnormalities. But if you look down here at the bottom of something more recently called the autosomal dominant version, you'll have to forgive me, in the nerves of talking, I always muddle these words. How you guys cope with these scientific names like I won't even try and pronounce it, is amazing. But the hematuria, but not necessarily having hearing loss and no eye abnormalities, offers a very significant difference between the two. And what I wanted to do is to take you through some cases. Now, my cases are obviously not in the clinic. These are online on our Facebook groups. So as patient organizations, we run these closed Facebook groups, and they are lifelines for a lot of patients to connect and discuss their condition. But we have a lot of misunderstandings occurring on these Facebook groups. So scenario 1, a woman with protein in her urine, recently diagnosed and labelled as a carrier by the clinician, and the fact that she needs ACE inhibitors. And the insurers actually tell her that no, they're not going to fund ACE inhibitors because she's a carrier. Now, this is causing a real problem and huge anxiety for a patient who knows that there is a drug out there that she can have that potentially could stop her going into renal failure. Then case 2. In terms of this case, another woman with X-linked Alport syndrome in her 50s, and the Alport community decided, there was lots of discussions around our workshop in Germany, in Göttingen, hosted by Oliver Gross. And there we discussed the carrier term, and that it was no longer helpful to use carrier. So people on Facebook rushed to describe anybody who came onto Facebook describing themselves as a carrier as actually having full-blown Alports. This poor woman was suicidal when she misunderstood this. Because also you have to remember that every woman with Alport syndrome is potentially sandwiched between being a daughter of somebody with Alport syndrome and potentially a mother of people, all potentially with transplants and dialysis as well. And I think a lot of us, the age that we're all at, will understand the sandwich generation and what it feels. But if you've got those added complications, it really can scramble your mind sometimes. So she was worrying desperately about whether she'd have to go through dialysis and transplantation as well, whilst she was holding up aging parents and children who are going through critical major operations. Case 3. Case 3 is a man in his 40s, a very sad case. His precious transplant begins to fail. His hearing declines, and he also discovers that he has eye issues too. And without proper information from an eye expert, he assumes that he will go blind as well as his deafness. Very sadly, this chap committed suicide. Case 4 is a woman diagnosed with thin basement membrane nephropathy, and she was told that it was benign. Now she's had genetic testing, and during a routine check, she discovers that her kidneys are actually declining. She feels let down, and we're getting more and more of these cases. And misdiagnosis is actually pulling down the mood of our community when they should be focusing on living their lives. Because the lovely thing about Alports, you will see, is you would have no idea that I have a rare disease. And I've usually, it's meant that I could get on and have a normal life. And for large chunks of our lives, they can be normal. Then the final scenario, case 5. A woman diagnosed with FSGS and put on steroids. We heard about some of those with the earlier talk. Given a genetic test and re-diagnosed as Alport syndrome. Now anxious about whether her kidneys will fail and if she will go deaf and have eye issues. The anxiety of not knowing is huge. And I think the overall message about this is that everyone is different. And that with all the incredible research on genetics, the more information we know, it's almost the less we know. And the less that we understand, actually, that there are so many grey areas on this table, that everyone is different. And that has to be a really important message that comes across when people are diagnosed, even within a family. And of course, rather than being a condition that affects men, the importance of actually diagnosing women. So why do labels make us feel different? The whole business of not knowing creates such anxiety and often causes a lot of mental health issues. But names are social markers. What you are called can have such an important impact. How we feel about ourselves, but also how others perceive us. When I first started in business, a very wise director of the company I was working for said Susie was rather an informal name, and he'd rather introduce me as Susan, which actually was my real name. But the only person who ever called me that was my grandfather. And to be honest, I never answered to the name. Names are very complex things, and it is really important because it's not just about rational things, it's also these emotional things, and also names can become a brand. Labels can really impact people's mental health. Now, the challenge of labels here, and I cite these examples from Alport Warriors, which is the name of our closed Facebook group, which was named by one of the lovely mums who set up the group originally. On the left, of course, we just have the more neutral words that we as moderators have learnt to use, because the right-hand column can really get our emotive words that can really get people quite upset. And we really have to be very aware of the negative implications of the words, things like sufferer and time bomb. So moving on to the final section of this, I'm really talking more from my own experience as a businesswoman, as a business consultant, focusing on branding and marketing and large-scale change in multinationals. I'd like you to spot the most used label on this slide. So you can hear in Italian, Alport, Alport UK, in German, in Australia, in the States, in Israel. Even in China, it's written here in Roman letters. The branding that our patients call themselves, Alport Warriors, they've even taken it actually to stash. For those of you not familiar with the term, which I was educated recently by my boys, it's the term for branded kit. We use the branded kit actually to make people feel better. And these are hoodies that are handed out to the kids when they need transplants or are going through a very tough time. Even for our alliance, it's a very, very important term for our global network that's advancing treatments and knowledge. But there's also beyond, and I suppose the point I didn't make as a business consultant is the dollars invested in creating those brands around the world. But also the labelling and branding is also supported by the years of published research that all of you have done. And this is some of the more recent stuff in the Kidney Press, in Kidney International or NDT, and also here in JASON. You'll be glad to see that this is an article about women and girls. But also not just the nephrology press, but also some of our amazing clinicians like Cliff Cashton publishing in wider journals, because as a syndrome, it's really important that we get our messages out to the broader community. And some more recent stuff around pregnancy as well for the obstetric and gynecological teams. So there's decades built up around that. We reached out to Doug Gould about what labelling and branding can achieve. And it was really intriguing. He wrote the most delightful email about how the foundation needed a name and how it united a syndrome that was very fragmented with other clinically defined names. And I think I love the term here, the alphabet soup of the collagen details. I can never remember which one I have because it's one of those things that's not as important. It is important to some people, and I think it will be increasingly important with precision medicine, and so it is important that we learn about it, but it is quite hard for us patients to follow. And I love the idea that people are comforted by this brand because it is something that they can unify around. So talking technically, this is a model. Us business consultants like models. It's an incomplete one because I don't want to bore you. It's a lesson in its own right that would take hours. But Kevin Keller, who's a professor of marketing in the States, used a very useful model to actually explain how people become very attached. And that there's an intense sense of loyalty that you can build up towards if you invest in both the rational and the emotional aspects of names and labels. And I think obviously there are brands like 3M. For those of you who know the history of 3M, it is a phenomenal organization that had a very long name before that most people wouldn't know what it was now. It's kind of unimportant. But I challenge anybody who would go out and buy Post-it notes that weren't 3M. It has a phenomenal loyalty around the brand of 3M. Now, Alicia talked about the guiding principles, which are an essential part, because when you get all the emotions involved in naming, you really do need some rational criteria that you can resort to around the naming project. It's really important. And they're vital ones for us to keep remembering. And pronounceable is a very important thing because most of our patients are quite young too. A lot of the children need to be able to pronounce the condition that they have. In terms of the people that we've involved, this is the broad stakeholder group. So we've tried to get people to engage at the national level, also at the international level. So we're working with lots of different patient groups around the world. We're about to embark on a workshop with the Alport Foundation of Australia. We've done work with the States and China and all over the place. But actually involving our scientific community across all the different disciplines is vital. But we're also very keen to collaborate with industry partners. And this is diversity in action. I challenge anybody who uses diversity as a token effort in anything they're trying to do to be innovative. But this is really important that it's a multi-stakeholder discussion, as Alicia alluded to. And in terms of the impact of the naming workshops, they're absolutely vital because they really engage and educate what is becoming a growing community to understand more about Alport syndrome. But I have to say that as we're a project in the middle of the process, the impact yet is unclear. And we are making sure that we keep an open mind on the name. But there are some critical success factors for anybody embarking on a naming project about how to engage the community. I've talked a bit about the value of the Alport Syndrome Alliance, but also making sure that patients, laboratory scientists, clinicians, coders, insurers are all involved in the discussion, any stakeholders that are impacted by the name. And also the feedback from somebody like Alicia, having an independent observer who can work through the politics and use data and discussion and evidence is hugely helpful. And we gather those through workshops and surveys. And as I said, the engagement and education is vital. So really to finish, and I feel very privileged to be able to finish the session, is that patients really are central to the debate. And so please don't rely on tokenism to have one or the odd one here or there to give an opinion, because we are all incredibly different depending on the different contexts that we have. And here's a little message from Lola, aged 10. Going through Alport syndrome is not fun, but when I came to Newcastle, this was in England, to meet other people like me, I had a lot of changes happening to me, and I was scared, but they told me that I'm a brave warrior. I feel better now. And the value of coming to these support sessions, which happen in many different countries, is so important. So finally, the key learning points from the talk. Living with Alport syndrome is fraught with emotion. There are many people still undiagnosed, and I really heartily encourage you to find those mothers out there and stop them from going into renal failure and giving them ACE inhibitors. The genetic diagnosis removes the uncertainty, both for the clinician, because the clinician deserves to know what condition they're treating, but also for the patient. The patient deserves to know what condition they have. The challenge of labels. Remember Sam's story. It's always very complicated. But a simple name unites the community, and certainly that's the case for Alport, and certainly in the situation of the Gould community as well. Labeling and brands can achieve so much more than just genotype, pathology, or phenotype. So please remember those other elements. And we really encourage you to collaborate with the impacted stakeholders, whoever they are in your communities. And keep an open mind so that you all as a community can land on something that really is successful and helps define things going forward. So I'm going to finish by going back, because I realize that it's nearly a century since Cecil Alport in 1927 first defined the family and combined the features of kidneys and hearing. It wasn't until the 1960s that the name Alport was actually used as an eponymous name. But it's very important for this lovely group of people here who are patients who participate in our international workshops and really care about what you decide. It's really important to them. And I really encourage those countries who are not yet involved in our naming project or in supporting patients. Please do reach out to us at the Alliance, because we're really keen to expand our global network and make sure that we can support patients better going forward. Thank you very much.